So where can I get away? Where can I go to get away from your spirit? Apparently nowhere. Because most of us have tried, and we're still here. I find Psalm 139 incredibly comforting, while at the same time, even a bit frightening. You've examined me, you know me. When I sit down, when I stand up, from near and far, you are thoroughly familiar with all of my ways. It is frightening to me for anyone to know everything about us, huh? When I was growing up, I always thought my mother had eyes in the back of her head. She knew stuff that I did, and most of the time before I did it. I later realized that in a small town, she had informants. They were everywhere, and there were a lot of them. My husband knows me well enough to complete my sentences, but neither Dean nor my mother know everything about me. And even what Dean does know and my mother knew, they still love me. So why should it surprise us that even though God has examined us and is thoroughly familiar with all of our ways, that God calls us anyway? Maybe God calls us because God has examined us and knows us and is thoroughly familiar with all of our ways. Maybe that's why God calls us. Friends, this is the good news, bad news. God knows you inside and out and calls you anyway. And once you're called, you can't escape it. It's a mandatory opportunity. You know, God has a tendency throughout history to call the least expected, even those ragamuffin disciples. You know, even Hollywood gets it. How many of you have seen Bruce Almighty or Evan Almighty? Raise your hand. Okay? All right. So no offense to these two men, but if God can call Steve Carell and Jim Carrey, surely God can call us, right? Now, there's this great scene in Bruce Almighty, and I can't show you the clip tonight, so just imagine this with me for a minute, and if you've seen the movie, it'll come to you really quick. God pages Bruce. It's an old movie. Today, God would have sent a text, Instagram, Vine, something. But anyway, in this movie, God pages Bruce to meet him for a job interview. Okay, scene coming in your mind? It's a super bright white warehouse. And God, I love this, played by Morgan Freeman, knows a lot about Bruce, tells him he even knows about his father. And he tells Bruce Nolan that he knows everything he has ever done or thought about doing. And he points to this file cabinet over in the corner, and he says, "It's all right there." And Bruce sarcastically says, "Ha, look, a whole drawer just for me." You remember the next scene? Bruce pulls out that drawer, and it just goes on forever, pulls it all the way to the other end of the room, presses him up against the wall. It's this endless drawer. All that he has ever done or thought about doing, all right there in one big old drawer. And God still uses him. So whether you're in this ordination class or sitting out there, God's called you too. some to ordained ministry, some to lay ministry. God has called you whether you know it or not, and God still knows everything about you. There is no escaping. I tried for about 20 years. See how well it worked for me. The Psalms are typically so honest and deal with the day-to-day of human life. They capture this wide range of emotions. There's actually some who believe that Psalm 139 was actually composed by a religious leader who was accused of idol worship. And it was an appeal, a plea for God to investigate him fully. Is that not our hope as well? We want God to know the depth of our heart and soul, or do we? We want God to know us, but we don't really want God to know everything about us, do we? If God knew everything about us, God might actually ask us to do something we really don't want to do or don't feel equipped to do. Now you reach this point in your ministry after a great deal of prayer and discernment. Some of you may have even been running from God for a while. This is a God who shaped every cell in our bodies. This is a God who knows every hair on our head. And when we try to deny that or escape it or run away from it, God is still there. This is the inescapable God. No matter where you go, God is there. Even in the darkest times of your life, or maybe especially in the darkest times of our lives, God will be there. Ministry, like most of all of life, is filled with some dark moments. One of my bishop colleagues says that ministry can be like death by 1,000 paper cuts. It can be hard and it really hurts. You can hide in the bottom of your closet in a fetal position all you want, but God will still be there. The cancer diagnosis, the lost jobs, the lost spouse, the lost son or daughter, even then, God is there. It may be pretty dark, but it's like those curtains in your bedroom. Sometimes, no matter how well they close, there's often that little sliver of sunlight peeking through that reminds you that even though it's dark inside, there is light all around. Frankly, sometimes we're not ready for that moment when you pull back those drapes and that light just blinds you. Sometimes we might need to stay in the dark, maybe just for a little while, but always with the certainty that there is light behind the veil of darkness. A few months ago, I was at Epworth by the Sea on St. Simon's Island for the Bishop's Learning Retreat. It's a beautiful place filled with rich Wesleyan history. And I woke up because I needed to make a potty run. And the room was absolutely dark. As I was coming out of the bathroom, I thought, gosh, I heard the birds singing. I thought, that's odd. The birds don't usually sing like that in the middle of the night. And I crawled back in bed and I looked over at the alarm clock, and it was 6:30 in the morning. Even though my room was as dark as night, behind those blackout curtains, the sun had risen on my darkness. Is that not the good news of the psalm and the good news of the gospel. In times of despair, there is indeed light, even and especially when life gets pretty dark. I did find it fascinating in one of the commentaries that I read that the writing of this psalm was likely around the same time as the writing of Job. Can you see that? Even when times are trying, when all we see is despair, it is then and especially then that God's light shines bright. From now on, we cannot be in darkness. As a matter of fact, according to the psalmist, there is no darkness. Even when we're groping around in pitch dark, eventually our eyes do adjust. God has knit us together, woven us together for this time and for all of our times so that we might be light in an otherwise dark world. Oh, if only we came with an owner's manual or some diagram or flow chart of our life. Because while there are times of great clarity, there are also those times that we're unsure if we're actually the ones being called. We often take some detours in our life of ministry, yet what I know, and I know that you know as well, is that God uses everything in your life. My good friend Jen Kerwick and I were talking one day about our previous lives, our previous careers. She was a high-powered lawyer, and I ran in the fast lane of the marketing world. And often people ask us if we feel that we wasted all those years. We both agreed that our answer is always absolutely not. God does not waste anything. Anything. All that you bring to this altar tonight, as hands are placed on your head and shoulders and the words of commissioning and ordination are shared, all that you bring, the good and the not so good, is more than enough. It's more than enough. God has created your innermost parts, and it says it right here. You were marvelously set apart. See, I've told this group I have a hard time with that word marvelously. I really prefer the word in Spanish. It's maravillosa. It just sounds so much better anyway. It's one of those words that just feels good in your mouth. Ustedes están maravillosos. You are maravillosos because it is God who created you. We talked this afternoon about the why and our tendency to want to move to the what and the how. The why in this story is actually the who, not the band, the Who. Where's Matt Rawle? Not the band, the Who. But stick with me for a moment. The why is the who. The who here is God. The who is at the very center. This is what this psalm is all about. Our identity is about who God is. We are made in the image of God. You know, we could so easily get caught up in how marvelous we are. Estamos maravillosos porque el Señor nos has creado. We are marvelously made because it is God who has created us. God is the God who is light. In him there is no darkness at all. The night and the day are both alike. I love that Advent hymn. I want to walk as a child of the light. Frankly, it's my prayer It's my prayer for us as an annual conference each day that we might walk as children of the light. Because when we become disconnected with God, darkness starts to creep in. And it is then that God pursues us even more. That seems counterintuitive by the world's standards, but not by God's. There are times and places when we look around and we say, God cannot possibly be here. When we were in Israel with the Ordinance and 90 of our closest friends in January, we traveled from site to site, as most people do. And the guides are always really careful to tell you that this site or that site is considered by some to be the birthplace of Jesus or could be the site of. There's always this disclaimer because there are a few places where we know for sure that Jesus actually walked. Now, as I walked in some places, I did the Chevy Chase family vacation look. Seen it, done it, time to go. Because I thought to myself, there is no way Jesus was here. And there were other places that you couldn't peel me away from because I just knew it. I knew that Jesus had been there. It was interesting that some places that were no-way places for me, others were absolutely certain of the Savior's presence. I walked into what I call the Church of the Holy Gaudiness, otherwise known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I'm really sorry if I might offend some of you, but there are zillions of people in that place. As many faith traditions claim that as their holy space. But it was really gaudy to me. And I thought, there's no way Jesus was here. This is a no-way place for me. Then as I walked out, people were weeping as they were overcome with the presence of the Lord. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, did I miss something? Maybe God was in there and I missed it. Because you and I don't get to decide where God is or where God isn't. This psalm clearly says that God is everywhere. Maybe our job is simply to be aware of God in our midst. In Nadia Bolz-Weber's book, Pastrix, she speaks of her experience in clinical pastoral education as she lived and died with people each day. On one of her early days in her CPE training, she was paged to the ER. She didn't even know where the ER was. And when she finally found it, she was greeted by the security guard, and she says, I was paged. And the security guard pointed Nadia to the door that read, "No admittance," where she caught the eye of a nurse who pointed to trauma room 1. Inside the trauma room, she recalls a nurse cutting clothes off a motionless man. Tubes were everywhere, and they were doing things to him not meant for her eyes. Another nurse was hooking him up to things when a doctor motioned for paddles. He placed those paddles into the motionless man's cracked chest. And at that point, Nadia turned to the nurse and said, everyone seems to have a job, but what am I doing here? The nurse looked at her badge and said, your job is to be aware of God's presence in the room while we do our jobs. Is that not our job, friends, laity and clergy alike? To be aware of God's presence in the room. We don't get to decide where God is. That means you and I are to be aware of God's presence, especially in some of those no way Jesus could be here kind of places. The prison cell, the orphanage in Haiti or Africa, the school in your neighborhood that's been forgotten. The psalmist says, everywhere you go, there I am. This is not a solitary role we play. We are marvelously made on purpose and for purpose. We've been brought together for such a time as this, and friends, it is going to take every single one of us. I recently read a book entitled Sentness. It's a book about missiology. It's a great book. But one of the best chapters is entitled Shared Life. It begins with a quote from Australian missiologist Michael Frost. When we have no impressive buildings and no swollen budgets to sustain our work, often only then do we realize that the best we have to offer this post-Christendom world is the quality of our relationships, the power of our trustworthiness, and the wonder of our generosity. Relationships, trustworthiness, generosity. None of these are solitary. All are experienced in community. The author talks about going to get a tattoo and asking the tattoo artist to tattoo the word diatribo on her body. It's Greek, she offers, and it means to rub between, like rubbing off on one another. The English translations are stayed with or abide with, but Kim Hammond, the author, claims that that's not a sufficient definition. She says, diatribo is a way of life led by the Savior. I want to live with the same sacrificial purpose, that any good that God has redeemed in me and through me would graciously and generously rub off on others. It reminds me to give priority to relationships and to stay with people God puts with me, even and maybe especially when staying is hard, when staying hurts. The Christian life is hard work, but it calls us into community. Just think about each time you pass the peace in a worship service. Is it just some liturgical move for you? Gosh, I hope not. Next time you shake the hand of a stranger or a visitor, think about diatribo. You might just rub off on them, or better yet, they might rub off on you. I suppose that's why I love this New Testament text that was read, and it's probably overused. But the image of the body is so critical to this notion that we might rub off on each other. I find it interesting that Paul chooses to use something as so imperfect as the body to describe the church. There's always something about our bodies we don't like. We're too short, too tall, too thin, not so thin, too much hair, not enough hair. Some people have a funky big toe or a big nose, but without that big toe, you lose your sense of balance. So funky as it might be, without it, you might fall. Some of us with big noses may not like our snout, but without it, I wouldn't be able to smell the fresh cut flowers that were given to me on my birthday. So as imperfect as the body is, each and every part is indeed important. It is even maravilloso. And as Nadia Bolz-Weber says, God makes beautiful things out of our own stuff. And by the way, she doesn't say stuff. Reverend Bolz-Weber, who, by the way, is going to be at Centenary in 2015. Reverend Bolz-Weber is a Lutheran clergywoman with a colorful past, a very colorful vocabulary, and an even more colorful and vibrant ministry in Denver. I recommend her book, but warn you now about the language. God does make beautiful things out of our own stuff. Even as stinky as our stuff is, God calls you and me stinky stuff and all. God calls us to a life of sanctification. It's only when we discover that God really loves us in all of our brokenness that we start to be godlike, little g, says Frederick Buechner. Paul's words of the transformation of a sow's ear into a silk purse is sanctification, he says. He also says that many drop out with the job hardly more than begun. Among those who stay with it are few, if any, who don't drag their feet most of the way. But little by little, less by taking pains than taking it easy, the forgiven person starts to become a forgiving person, the healed person, a healing person, the loved person, a loving person. And God does most of it, he says. So, what are we to make of that passage that I have so much trouble with? That kill the wicked passage. Notice we didn't read it tonight. The lectionary, by the way, leaves it out too. I really wish the psalm would just end before that. Not only hates, but he has perfect hatred, as it's said 3 times. Hate everyone who hates you. Despise those who attack you. Hate them through and through. One thought is that perhaps this is a natural reaction to our human condition, our own experience of pain. We do hate all that is not of God. We hate the cancer, the addiction, the loss of a job. You want to tell those things to just go away. Get out of my way. I hate you. Because the God you know is the God of life and the God of light. Then it's as if the psalmist catches himself, because it quickly turns to back to that redemptive language. Search me and know my heart. Lead me on to the eternal path. God knows you, friends. God knows you so well that God has chosen you for such a time as this. And it's an incredibly important time to be a United Methodist. It's an incredibly important time to be commissioned and ordained to lead the church into a fruitful future. The church needs diatribo, needs you to rub off on each other and on those out there who are yet to know the living God. Here once again from Cynthia. This rubbing of life on life is the core of what it means to be a disciple of a missionary God. Jesus entered into the lives of strangers and formed a band of brothers and sisters. If the church simply did this in our day, we would radically change the world. God will radically change the world through you and because of you. Remember, God knows everything about you, calls you anyway. Even in your darkness, God will use it too, because in him there is no darkness at all. The night and the day are both alike. So whatever you bring, whatever you place at the altar of your ordination and commissioning, God's going to use it. Because God doesn't waste anything. God does not waste anything. Thanks be to God for that.